Massive forces are moving through the wild, leaving behind towering prints in the soil, strange branch patterns and guttural growls in the night. Survivors return broken, their silence heavier than any explanation officials can offer. From hunters massacred in Montana to a climber stalked in Yosemite, no place has been safe. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling Bigfoot encounters that expose the dangers lurking in the wilderness. On April 18, 2025, 5 skilled hunters entered the wild backcountry of Montana, prepared for a long trip far from roads and towns. The first day passed without trouble, but by the second night, fear spread quickly through their camp. They sent a desperate message, saying strange growls surrounded them, and some of their gear had been disturbed. Items that should have been left scattered were instead stacked in odd shapes, arranged as if placed by a hand with purpose. The men were uneasy, but no one expected what would follow in the dark hours ahead. That night, their quiet clearing was torn apart. Heavy tearing sounds echoed through the trees as tents were ripped wide open, fabric flapping like shredded paper. The hunters' rifles were smashed against rocks, bent and broken beyond use. Sharp thuds rolled across the ground, shaking the camp as though something huge was stomping in circles. Branches cracked overhead, and nearby trunks bore long, deep slashes, as if clawed by something immense. The noise came from all directions. A storm of violence pressed into one small clearing. By morning, the clearing no longer held a living soul. The hunters were gone. Only their blood-stained clothes lay scattered among broken supplies, a grim sign of what had happened. The air was thick and still, but the ground told its own story. In the soft, wet earth, enormous tracks had sunk deep. Each impression was nearly 1.5 feet in length, wide, flat, and shaped unmistakably like a bare foot, yet far too big to belong to any man. The steps carried forward into the trees with measured rhythm, heavy enough to push into the soil with lasting weight. Close by, the woods bore further evidence. Branches had been broken down and set into crude lines that pointed deeper into the forest. These strange signs were not the work of wind or storm, but the deliberate placement of something that wanted to guide or warn. The unsettling patterns added to the terror of the scene. Around the gouged trees, the silence was oppressive, broken only by distant crashes far off in the wilderness, as though the presence that had struck still lingered. The animals of the region had fled. No birds sang above the canopy, and no small tracks marked the dirt. Signs of wildlife showed only frantic flight, as if all creatures had been chased out by something far stronger. The chaos of the camp, the shredded shelters, the ruined weapons, and the missing men painted one clear picture. Something powerful and intelligent had moved through the Montana backcountry, leaving ruin in its wake. The message the hunters had sent was the last trace of them. Their frantic words about growls and shifted gear proved true when the site was found, but nothing remained of the men themselves. The forest gave back no bodies, no remains, only scattered blood, broken belongings, and the crushing weight of silence. Whatever had come out of the trees had taken them completely, leaving behind only signs of strength and cunning that no ordinary predator could match. Word of the massacre spread quickly, carrying fear into towns and villages near the wild. Locals whispered of a massive figure that not only killed but also arranged, marked and moved with chilling intent. The strange footprints, the patterns in branches, and the silence left in its path suggested something more than animal instinct. Something unknown had stepped out of the shadows, and the forest had swallowed 5 hunters whole. When the search ended at the ruined camp, the real weight of the event began to spread far beyond the clearing. Officials spoke of predators, but their words did little to calm the fear that had already rooted itself in the nearby towns. The sight of torn shelters, shattered weapons, and the eerie patterns left among the trees was too strange to accept as the work of any normal beast. Locals whispered in hushed voices, avoiding the subject in public. But behind closed doors, stories grew of something inhuman that had taken the hunters without a trace. Families of the missing men were left without answers. They held quiet funerals, with nothing more than scraps of clothing and a few personal items to bury. The weight of loss was heavy, but what made it worse was the silence surrounding the truth. Without bodies, without clear evidence, the grief became endless questions that no one could settle. Children of the hunters woke from nightmares, speaking of heavy steps in the woods, while wives and parents locked doors earlier each evening, uneasy with the thought of something massive still moving in the dark. The surrounding land began to change. Trails once used for hunting trips were abandoned. Cabins sat empty, and dogs that had roamed freely now refused to leave porches. Even wildlife seemed altered. Birds stayed quiet. Deer no longer passed near the site, and the usual calls of the forest fell still. The silence itself became a warning, pressing down on those who dared to enter. Rangers who checked the area admitted to feeling watched, though they reported nothing official. Their brief visits ended quickly, leaving the clearing untouched, as though the earth itself held a scar that should not be disturbed. The story spread beyond Montana, carried by travelers, online whispers, and campfire retellings. What had begun as the disappearance of 5 hunters turned into a tale of a massacre carried out by something not just strong but deliberate. The footprints, the stacked branches, and the scattered belongings became symbols of a predator that did not kill from hunger, but from a darker force. People believed it was a warning left in plain sight, meant to be seen and remembered. In the end, the site faded back into the wilderness, but its memory stayed alive. For locals, it was no longer a place of game and open land, but of fear and silence. The hunters were gone, but what had taken them remained, unseen yet always near in thought. To this day, the backcountry is avoided, a place spoken of only in whispers, where the echo of that spring night still hangs in the trees. On June 14th, 2024, the morning light in Yosemite barely touched the cliffs when a climber set out alone. The air was damp and mist clung to the stone as he pulled himself higher, rope and gear carefully checked. He stopped on a narrow ledge, breathing steadily when the silence broke. Above him came heavy thuds, each one shaking the rock, too slow and too heavy to be falling stone. His head snapped upward, but before his eyes could fix on the source, something huge lunged forward. A dark shape crashed down from the ridge, brushing past with force strong enough to dislodge a boulder. The rock smashed onto the slope below, narrowly missing him. His grip tightened as his pulse surged. The cliff suddenly more dangerous than ever. Scrambling across the ledge, he saw signs in the soil where it had not yet hardened from morning dew. Impressions pressed deep into the ground, wide and long, nothing like boots. Each step sank inches down, heavy enough to bend roots beneath them. The distance between prints was wide, stretched further than a human stride, showing whatever had passed carried both weight and height. He moved faster, but the sound of breaking branches followed. He glanced left and caught a glimpse of snapped trunks, claw marks scoring into bark so deep they stripped away thick layers of wood. These cuts were higher than his reach, jagged yet strong, proof of something immense pulling across the trees. The cliffside seemed alive with threat. He steadied his breathing, clinging to rock while scanning the tree line. Small animals that usually darted across the path were absent. No birds circled, and no insects buzzed. The forest below was still, unnatural in its quiet. Each beat of silence carried weight until it broke with another crack, branches snapping under a force moving deliberately through the brush. His eyes caught movement on an outcrop above, a shape crouched in shadow, unmoving, almost hidden in the folds of stone. Its outline showed shoulders too broad, arms hanging long, head angled downward. For a moment it simply stayed, watching him. Fear gripped him harder than the climb itself. His body wanted to freeze, but instinct forced him to keep moving, hands trembling as he reached for the next grip. His boots slipped once, knocking pebbles loose, and the sound echoed against the valley walls. The shadow above shifted, as though answering his stumble. The climber pressed his body flat to the rock, waiting, unable to tell if it would leap again. The distance closed with every sound from above, each step placed with a slow rhythm, circling. In those moments, the ridge was no longer just stone and trees. It was a stage for a predator. The claw marks, the broken branches, and the thudding steps all pointed to deliberate stalking. His pulse hammered. The cliff no longer a challenge of skill, but a fight for survival against something massive and unseen, lurking within Yosemite's dawn mist. The climber pressed against the stone, every muscle locked as the shadow above shifted and then melted back into the rocks. For a moment, he thought it was gone, but the silence that followed was even worse. The forest below remained unnaturally still. No rustle of leaves, no cry of birds, only the echo of his own breath scraping against the cold air. He pushed himself upward with trembling hands until the ridge finally leveled into a wide ledge. There, the ground showed clearer signs of what had moved before him. Massive impressions dented the soil, wide and deep, each shaped like a foot, yet stretched to lengths that no human could ever leave. Nearby trees bore more than clawed gouges. Some branches had been twisted off and arranged in strange shapes, leaning together like symbols. A broken log was dragged across the clearing, placed deliberately instead of falling naturally. It was as though something had left behind marks not only of strength but of thought, arranging the forest into patterns he could not understand. He backed away, heart hammering, refusing to linger in the open. At the trail's end, wildlife remained absent. No tracks of deer, no sign of rodents, not even insects humming. It was as if the entire ridge had been cleared, a space claimed by a presence that tolerated no intruders. He felt the weight of eyes, even when he could see nothing. The sense of being followed as he descended by another route, desperate to leave the cliffs behind. When he finally reached the base, his body shook so violently he could hardly manage his rope. He stumbled to the ranger station and gave his account, but officials dismissed it as the panic of a lone climber. They said he had mistaken a bear for something larger, that the scratches were natural, that the prints were just erosion in the soft ground. His words were written down and quickly set aside. Yet those who heard his story in the towns surrounding Yosemite did not dismiss it so easily. Whispers grew of something territorial that stalked the cliffs at dawn. Climbers began avoiding that ridge altogether, unwilling to risk the silence and the strange marks left behind. For the man who had faced it, no comfort ever came. His dreams filled with heavy steps echoing above him, and each morning he woke certain the cliffs still held the presence that had spared him only to watch him leave. On July 9th, 2023, the calm of a remote reserve in the Pacific Northwest was broken when rangers stumbled upon a scene of horror near a roaring waterfall. 3 backpackers lay lifeless by the stream, their bodies sprawled close to the rushing water. At first sight, it seemed they had drowned, yet closer inspection told another story. Their lungs held no water. Instead, their skin bore deep bruises, their bones showed crushing force, and long, tearing marks ran across them, as though something immense had slammed them with violent strength. The falls drowned out every other sound, but the silence in the forest above seemed heavy, as if holding a dark secret. Around the bodies, the land itself revealed chilling signs. Bags and supplies were not simply dropped in panic, they were scattered in strange, unnatural ways. Some packs were stacked one on top of another on the rocks, balanced carefully as if placed with intent. Others lay in circles, their contents spread out in neat lines across the wet ground. This was not chaos made by frightened people. It was an arrangement, deliberate and unsettling. Even more disturbing were the shapes pressed into the mud along the stream bank. Enormous impressions stretched several feet in length, wide and deep, shaped like feet, but far larger than any human could leave. The trees surrounding the scene carried their own marks. Bark was gouged high above reach, deep scars carved into the wood as though made by massive claws. Branches had been broken and leaned together into crude signs, forming arrow-like points that directed toward the forest's heart. These markings suggested something had not just passed through, but had chosen to leave behind a message. Rangers moved carefully, unease spreading with every step, the roar of the falls no comfort against the weight of the silence. The attack itself seemed sudden and merciless. The three hikers had likely camped nearby, drawn by the beauty of the towering falls, their voices drowned by the endless crash of water. Yet whatever emerged from the shadows came with power enough to end them before they could flee. The wounds showed bodies tossed, slammed, and clawed as if by a predator of impossible size. No gear had been used, no defense mounted. Their rifles, knives, and tools were untouched, scattered yet unharmed, as though strength alone had been enough to finish them. Authorities hurried to call it an animal encounter, placing blame on a wandering bear. Yet those who had seen bears knew better. No bear left prints shaped like feet. No bear stacked packs in neat towers. And no bear tore bark from trees high above a man's reach while breaking branches into shapes that pointed the way forward. To those who walked the scene, the truth was clear. This was not a random strike of hunger. It was something larger, cunning, and deliberate. The waterfall, once a place of beauty, had become a stage for violence. As the mist rose and the water roared, the land itself seemed marked forever by what had happened there. This was no accident. It was an ambush, carried out with force and intent, leaving behind both death and a warning. And somewhere beyond the falls, deeper in the woods, the one who had struck was still waiting. When rangers left the waterfall clearing, the sense of dread did not fade. Word of the discovery spread quickly through nearby towns, and with it came unease that touched every household. Families who once hiked the reserve now stayed home, unwilling to step into woods that could hide such force. The site where the three had fallen was quietly closed, trails rerouted to keep visitors away, but people still spoke of the silence that had hung in the trees and the strange patterns left among the rocks. The families of the dead backpackers were left with questions no one could answer. Funerals were held in private, but whispers followed the mourners long after. Locals spoke of old tales about vast shapes that had been glimpsed in mist near rivers and falls, and now those stories no longer seemed like simple legends. The stacked packs and towering prints were taken as proof that something with reason had been there, moving unseen, but leaving its warning. Fear turned into avoidance, and the reserve that once drew campers and hikers began to empty. Officials continued to insist on the story of a predator, writing in their reports that the bruising could have come from a violent struggle and the marks on trees from the claws of a large bear. Yet even those who had walked the site struggled to accept that. The way gear had been placed too carefully, the prints too wide and human-shaped, and the branches broken into crude signs did not fit with chance or panic. These details passed by word of mouth, spreading faster than any official statement, convincing many that the wilderness held something beyond explanation. In the weeks that followed, the falls became a place of avoidance. Animals that had once drunk from the stream no longer came near. Birds stayed away from the canopy above, leaving the area strangely quiet. Hunters and anglers spoke of the air feeling too heavy, pressing against the skin in ways that made them turn back. Even rangers who patrolled other parts of the reserve refused to step into that valley alone, saying the roar of water could not cover the weight of being watched. The wilderness carried the scar of that summer, and the community carried the fear. The three who had died became part of a growing pattern of stories, each one tied by the same signs of something immense, clever, and merciless. The waterfall still roared, but behind its endless crash lingered the memory of a force that struck without warning and left only silence behind. On July 16, 2024, a firewatch crew took their post at a lonely tower in the forests of Montana. At first, the days passed in silence, but the nights quickly became strange. On the very first evening, they noticed gear was not where they had left it. Tools were moved, packs shifted, and supplies stacked in ways that made no sense. The second night brought even worse signs. Food that had been stored inside was discovered in piles, placed on top of one another in unnatural order, as if arranged carefully. Low noises rolled through the trees, thick and guttural, making the wooden structure shake. Each sound was heavy, rising and falling like a warning from something enormous moving below. By the third night, tension filled the air. The radio carried sudden panicked voices. The crew reported strange movement in the trees, then thudding impacts against the walls. The sounds grew louder, closer, as if something was climbing toward them. The voices on the line turned frantic. Screams filled the channel before everything went dead. When authorities finally reached the clearing, the scene looked like chaos frozen in place. The heavy door of the tower had been broken open, wood splintered and hinges twisted. Scattered across the dirt were pieces of clothing torn apart, boots ripped, and small belongings stained with blood. Radios lay smashed in the soil, their wires dangling. Around the base, the ground was stamped with massive impressions, each shaped like a foot, yet far too large to be human. The deep tracks circled the structure again and again, as though the intruder had studied every side before striking. Nearby, branches had been broken off and leaned together into strange shapes. Some pointed toward the dark forest, forming crude arrows that led away from the tower. The detail made the sight even more disturbing, showing that what had happened was not wild chance, but something that carried purpose. The forest around the clearing added to the dread. Birds were gone. Small animals had vanished. Even insects were silent. Closer to the trees, the remains of wildlife were found in shocking condition. Some creatures had been torn apart, their pieces left scattered in unnatural ways. Others were missing completely, as if carried away into the shadows. The stench of iron and decay hung in the air, but not a single scavenger approached the site. The forest itself seemed to have emptied in fear. One man survived by hiding near the clearing. His body shook when rescuers found him, his words broken, but he managed to describe what he had seen. He spoke of a huge figure, covered in thick hair, dragging one of his crew into the trees with ease. His face carried terror that no report could explain. Authorities wrote down his account, but later dismissed it as panic and shock, claiming a bear had caused the attack. But the prints told a different story, stretching far into the woods before ending at the edge of dense growth, where the trail vanished. Search parties pressed into the forest but returned shaken, reporting an unnatural heaviness in the air, a silence so complete that even their own footsteps seemed too loud. The deeper they went, the more they found broken branches leaning together in strange shapes, forming signs that looked intentional. Every marker seemed to pull them farther into the wilderness, yet nothing of the crew was ever recovered. The survivor who had spoken of a towering shape was moved from camp, but his state never improved. His hands trembled constantly. His eyes darted to corners no one else looked at, and his words never returned to normal. He avoided the outdoors entirely, refusing even to stand near windows. Those who saw him believed his mind was scarred by something he could not explain, an encounter too heavy for anyone to carry. His presence became a living reminder of what had happened on that tower. Officials who filed reports wrote of an attack by a large predator. They blamed the scattered belongings on panic and the shattered door on brute force. Yet no explanation was given for the stacked food, the deliberate shapes made with branches, or the wide impressions in the dirt. The public version of events left out those details, but those who had seen them kept the truth alive in whispers. Stories spread through towns, telling of a presence that was not only strong but also thoughtful, leaving signs behind as if to remind humans of its reach. In the months that followed, the tower was left empty. Workers refused to return, and the structure itself began to decay. Windows shattered in storms, and weeds grew around the base, but no one cleared them. Hunters avoided the entire section of forest, saying the silence itself was too heavy to trust. Families who lived near the region stopped camping, and even logging crews found other routes, unwilling to risk the oppressive stillness that hung over the trees. The place became more than just a ruin. It turned into a warning. Locals spoke of it only in quiet tones, saying the forest had claimed what it wanted and marked the land as its own. To them, the vanishing crew was not a mystery, but a message. Some parts of the wild do not belong to man, and what lives there is patient, powerful, and watching. On August 3, 2025, deep inside the Siberian taiga, a group of hunters set camp around a glowing fire after a long day of tracking game. The air was heavy and silent, The only sounds the crackle of burning wood and faint rustles of the forest. As the men settled, a sudden wave of guttural growls erupted from the shadows beyond the tree line. The noises were low but powerful, rolling across the clearing in unnatural tones. Before anyone could react, the undergrowth shook violently. Branches snapped, logs cracked, and a massive shape burst from the trees with terrifying force. The firelight flickered across a towering figure that moved with speed and power. The men were thrown to the ground as the firewood scattered and sparks shot into the air. The attack was brutal, but strangely controlled. One was struck hard, leaving welts across his arms. Another was slammed into the earth with such force that bruises bloomed instantly across his chest. A third was knocked back against the torn canvas of a tent, his clothes ripping as if shredded by rough claws. None of them could make sense of the speed or strength behind the blows. Their minds blurred in fragments, snapshots of a massive shadow moving through the firelight, a rush of air as something passed close, the sound of heavy limbs pounding into the ground. The chaos grew worse as the fire itself seemed to collapse under the weight of the attack. Flames scattered across dirt, sparks vanishing into the night. The hunters struggled to rise, but the assault came from all sides. They felt dragged, pulled, pushed, but never fully struck down. It was as if the force wanted them broken but alive. Each man later recalled moments of blackness, gaps in memory where time seemed lost. The growls faded in and out, sometimes circling, sometimes crashing in close, always pressing fear deeper into their bones. By the time dawn approached, the camp was destroyed. The hunters were found staggering near the tree line by search crews who had been sent after signals went silent. Their eyes were pale, their steps uneven, and their words made little sense. Torn clothes hung loose, streaked with soil, and their bodies carried deep bruises, cuts, and strange welts. What shocked rescuers more was the absence of their catch. The animals they had brought down the day before were gone, every trace of meat stripped away as if carried off in the night. Around the collapsed fire pit, the soil bore signs of something vast. Enormous impressions stretched several feet in length, shaped like human feet but impossibly wide and deep. Each step pressed down with weight no man or bear could make. Nearby, tall trees bore gouges slashed through their bark, claw marks carved into them at heights unreachable by hand. In the brush beyond, broken branches had been placed in crude arrangements, forming jagged, arrow-like patterns that seemed to point back into the endless forest. The officials who arrived later called it the work of a predator, most likely a bear, but the details, organized branches, missing game, strange memory gaps, and prints far beyond normal size, spoke of something more. For the men who lived through it, the night would never leave them. They knew it had not been random. It had been deliberate, precise, and far more intelligent than anything they had ever faced. Word spread through nearby towns, whispered in low tones that the taiga itself held a predator unlike any known creature, and the broken camp with its deep marks and vanished catch stood as proof of a warning too terrifying to ignore. When rescuers pulled the hunters from the wrecked camp, the aftermath began to spread beyond the forest. News of the attack moved quickly through nearby towns, but the official story stayed shallow. Authorities described it as an accident with a wild animal, something common in the taiga. Yet those who had seen the marks on the ground and the strange arrangements in the brush did not accept the simple answer. The men themselves could not explain the gaps in their memory. They remembered sudden force, heavy shadows and growls circling in the dark, but nothing clear enough to form into full accounts. Their voices shook when asked, their eyes turning away as though the details were too heavy to carry. Families of the victims struggled with the silence. They wanted answers, but instead they were given vague reports that mentioned nothing of the deep impressions in the soil or the unusual piles of branches pointing back into the trees. The lack of explanation only grew the fear. People who had worked in the forest for years began leaving their jobs. Campsites stood empty, trails unused, and villages near the edge of the taiga grew quiet at night. Dogs barked more often at nothing, refusing to step beyond porches as if sensing a presence still lingering. The men who survived did not return to their old lives. Their wounds healed, but their minds carried scars. They woke in the night drenched in sweat, hearts racing at imagined sounds. None of them picked up a rifle again. None returned to the wilderness that had once been their livelihood. Their stories, though broken and unclear, were enough to keep others away. Whispers spread that something cunning had used the firelight to strike, taking the fresh game as its prize and leaving the men alive only as shaken witnesses. Over time, the camp became a place avoided even by those who had no part in the tragedy. The remains of the fire pit stayed blackened, and the gouges in tree trunks remained visible for months. Travelers said the silence in that clearing felt heavier than in the rest of the forest, as if sound itself avoided it. The impression grew that what had happened was not a single accident, but a warning carved into the land. By the end of that summer, the hunter's story had become more than an isolated event. It was a tale told quietly, a reminder that the taiga holds secrets larger than any predator known, secrets strong enough to shatter lives and leave behind only fear. On June 18, 2022, a family living on a ranch in a quiet Idaho valley woke to find several goats missing from the pen. The wooden gate still hung on its hinges, showing no damage. No chains were broken, no locks bent, and the soil around the posts remained smooth. Even more strange, no boot prints, wheel tracks, or claw marks marked the ground. It was as if the animals had simply walked away on their own, yet the fence showed no gap for them to escape. The morning air felt heavy and silence pressed against the valley, leaving unease rather than answers. Through the day, they searched along the tree line, calling out and checking the brush, but no sound of bells or bleating came back. The goats had vanished into the stillness of the wilderness. By evening, worry gave way to fear when the first growls rolled across the open land. The sound came from the timber beyond the field, deep, long, and rough, not like wolves or bears. Each note rattled windows and made the livestock cluster together. The noise did not fade. It moved around the valley, circling closer as if keeping watch. Sleep never came that night. When the sun rose, the family saw a sight that froze them where they stood. The goats stood once again near the forest's edge, alive and whole but locked in unnatural stillness. They did not graze or wander. They only stood in a row as if waiting for something unseen. Their eyes looked glassy, their bodies tense, and they shifted only when pushed toward the pen again. The scene unsettled the family more than if the animals had been harmed. On the ground between the pen and the woods lay the first clear evidence of what had come. Massive impressions pressed deep into the dirt, each far wider and longer than any human step. They showed toes, rounded and spread, yet no claws like a bear would leave. Each print sank several inches into the earth, heavy with weight beyond any known animal. The line of tracks moved from the gate toward the trees and then back again, as if something had guided the goats out and later returned them. Among the trunks at the edge of the timber, branches told their own story. Several had been snapped and laid down not by chance but in a line. The shapes formed crude markers pointing deeper into the forest, deliberate enough to draw the eye. The careful arrangement suggested planning, not random damage. To the family, it was not just frightening but confusing. No predator known to them would return prey unharmed and leave behind signs like this. One member of the household, glancing toward the trees, swore to see a towering figure slipping into the shadows. The shape was tall and covered in thick hair, broad across the shoulders, moving with purpose before vanishing into the gloom. The glimpse lasted only seconds, but it left a weight that could not be shaken. Authorities later came to inspect the site. They gave easy answers, naming a bear as the culprit, but those who stood there knew the truth did not fit the details. Bears do not return animals alive. Bears do not place branches in order. Bears do not leave behind prints shaped like enormous feet, moving upright in steady strides. The family remained shaken, the memory of the growls and the still goats haunting them long after. Whispers spread quickly among neighbors, warning that the valley was not empty. Something vast, intelligent, and cunning had stepped out of the forest that night, and worse, it had made sure they knew it. After the authorities left, the silence of the valley returned heavier than before. The family tried to settle back into routine, but every sound outside now felt sharp. Every shadow seemed alive. Nights grew longer with the memory of guttural growls circling the ranch, and the thought of the goats standing frozen at the tree line would not leave their minds. Even during daylight, they felt eyes watching from the timber, unseen but constant. The land that once gave them peace had turned into a place of fear. The goats themselves were changed. They moved stiffly, avoiding the corners of the pen and pressing against each other as if for safety. They no longer bleated in the same way, but carried a quiet unease that spread to the rest of the animals. Horses in the nearby field shied away from the forest, and the dog, once brave and alert, would not step beyond the porch after dusk. Each creature seemed marked by the same dread that weighed down the humans who cared for them. In the days that followed, neighbors came to see the enormous impressions still visible in the soil. They measured each one and whispered among themselves, but no clear answer was ever spoken aloud. Some claimed the shapes matched old tales told in the valley about massive figures that moved upright and returned under cover of night. Others refused to say anything at all, only turning back to their homes with pale faces. The broken branches that had been set into crude patterns at the forest's edge were left untouched, as if no one dared disturb the signs. The family tried to carry on with their work, but unease touched everything. Tools were found shifted in the morning, not where they had been left. Buckets and feed sacks sometimes stood stacked in odd positions, too balanced to have fallen by chance. Each detail was small on its own, but together they painted the same picture. Something intelligent and strong still moved near the ranch. The knowledge of it weighed heavier with each passing night. Whispers spread through nearby towns, and soon the ranch became a subject of caution. Travelers spoke of the strange return of the goats, unharmed yet changed, and of the marks too large to belong to any known creature. Families in the valley began locking their barns earlier, keeping livestock closer to their homes. Some even sold their animals and moved away, unwilling to risk a night like the one that had shaken the ranch so deeply. For the family, the memory of that summer did not fade. The sight of the goat standing at the tree line with glassy eyes remained a vision that returned in dreams. The growls that had rolled through the valley echoed in their minds long after the sound itself had gone. To them, the message was clear. The valley was being watched, not by chance, but by something vast, deliberate, and aware. The place where they once found safety had become a warning ground. Even now, locals avoid the valley after dark, saying the soil still carries the weight of those steps and the silence of something that has not left.